This story happened to one of you subscribers. Write any 8-letter word in the comments if you've ever felt like you saw or heard something unexplainable. At the end of September, when autumn had fully taken hold, painting the Postojna forest in fiery hues, I finally convinced my friends to go on our annual camping trip. We left the car by the side of the main road leading into the forest, and after walking a bit further, came across an old moss-covered sign. The engraved letters on the darkened wooden background silently told us that this forest had been the site of bloody battles during the Austro-Hungarian War with the Ottoman Empire. The wind barely rustled through the fallen leaves, creating a sense of the past's presence, which seemed to still linger in these places. The sunset transformed the forest into something incomprehensibly enchanting and simultaneously frightening. The light became soft and warm, as if the last rays of the day were trying to cheer us up. But with each passing minute, the forest seemed deeper and more mysterious. The leaves on the trees were painted in crimson and golden shades, and the light mixed with the mist rising from the ground, adding an effect of an old faded photograph to the surrounding landscape. It even seemed to me that we were diving into the past, preparing for another escape into one of Croatia's most mysterious forests. By the time we reached our campsite, the forest was completely shrouded in darkness. The beams of our flashlights cut through the darkness, but it seemed to retreat only slightly, hiding behind the trees, illuminating the intricate web of branches and leaves that desperately clung to life in the cold autumn air. We set up our camp in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees that seemed to watch our every move, silently waiting to see what would happen next. The night brought deep shadows that completely engulfed the clearing, leaving only the campfire as the sole source of light and warmth. I decided to add more wood to the fire and stood up, feeling the cold breeze run across my skin. As I moved away from the fire, the darkness immediately swallowed me, as if gladly welcoming me into its embrace. The beams of our flashlights couldn't fully penetrate this darkness, and I felt something tighten inside me. A sudden sense of danger emerged in my mind, and then I saw them. A pair of bright eyes glowing in the darkness nearby, staring directly at me. For a moment, I thought it might be a reflection from a tourist's flashlight or some metal object forgotten in the forest. But the eyes didn't disappear. They remained in place, watching me intently. My heart began to beat faster. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that it was easy to be mistaken in the dark. But when I returned to the fire with the wood, I saw those same eyes again. And this time there were more of them. They glowed from different directions, as if surrounding me from all sides. It seemed that each pair of eyes was silently observing my every move, silently evaluating me. My anxiety turned into panic. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't let go. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, and my heart was beating somewhere in my throat. Each new pair of eyes that appeared from different corners of the forest seemed closer, more insistent. Their bright light pierced the darkness, and I could no longer look away. My body froze in terror. What were they? Animals? People? Something else? I didn't know, but I felt something cold and sinister slowly creeping towards us. When I finally sat back down by the fire, it seemed that its warmth could no longer chase away the cold that had crept into me. I realized that this forest hid something dark and ancient, something that had been waiting for us that night. And now I wasn't sure we could get out of here alive. When I felt those strange gazes on me, it became clear that it wasn't just my fear, but something much deeper. The feeling that this forest held memories of past horrors intensified. It seemed that each of those gazes belonged to those who had once fallen here in battle, their souls now wandering among the old trees, unable to find peace. I couldn't bring myself to involve the others in this sinister vision. Slowly, trying not to reveal my fear, I began to retreat back to the camp, feeling those eyes following me with each step. It was the feeling of something ancient that still hadn't found its retribution. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that it was all a play of light and shadow. But the more eyes appeared, the brighter and more real they became. These weren't just reflections. They were something alive and inevitable. The light they emitted was cold and unfamiliar, not something that could belong to the animals of this forest. When I returned to the camp with the flashlight in hand, Evo, one of my friends, spoke up fearfully, admitting that he had also seen those eyes watching us from the darkness. Then the others confessed that they had noticed them too, scattered among the trees. The atmosphere among us became incredibly tense. We huddled closer together, seeking protection in this eerie forest. The realization that something invisible was watching us gradually turned into unspeakable horror. We were part of something ancient and mystical, and it made our hearts beat even faster. We huddled around the campfire, gripped by a shared sense of anxiety. Fear paralyzed our bodies. We were afraid to move, and every sound in the darkness became a threat. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night, but its light seemed too weak to protect us from the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, Moran, one of our friends, slowly stood up. His eyes were wide open, but there was no awareness in them, as if he had fallen under the influence of some incomprehensible force. He silently walked to the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the forest darkness. We all called for him to come back, but he didn't respond, continuing to walk forward as if under the command of some invisible force. The horror I felt at that moment was unbearable, as if I were watching something irreversible, something we couldn't stop. When Moran disappeared from sight, the silence was suddenly shattered by a wild scream, deep and terrifying, piercing the air and making me shudder. My heart pounded even faster. Fear intensified to the limit, creeping into every cell of my body. I stood paralyzed by the sound, and at that moment, a faint glow appeared in the forest, like a pale light flickering between the trees. It lingered for a few minutes before suddenly fading, leaving me surrounded by thick darkness and silent mystery. The rest of us stood frozen, as if petrified, under the weight of the silence that filled the air with a heavy, suffocating uncertainty. We felt powerless, lost in the face of this invisible, mysterious threat that seemed to press down on us with every breath. The night stretched into infinity, and the darkness around us seemed alive, almost tangible, as it swallowed every beam of light from our dying fire. Our hearts beat in a wild rhythm of fear, every whisper of the wind or rustle of leaves conjuring irrational images of hidden enemies lurking in the darkness. We could only hope that dawn would bring us answers, or at least return Moran, who had vanished among the eerie shadows of the night. In the sleepless night, burdened with anticipation, every moment felt like an eternity, and the slightest sound in the forest triggered a sharp sense of anxiety. We huddled together, trying to find comfort in each other's presence, shuddering at every unexpected rustle or movement in the darkness, which seemed to draw its shadows ever closer to our refuge. But the horrors of that night didn't end. After a few minutes of tense waiting, Anna, our friend, suddenly stood up. Her eyes, like Moran's, reflected the same vacant look, as if she were being controlled by some invisible force pulling her into the deep darkness of the forest. Emma and I reacted instantly, rushing to her and grabbing her hands tightly. We tried to hold her back, but Anna looked at us with a strange aggression in her eyes, which no longer seemed to belong to her. Her face twisted with anger, and suddenly she bit into Ivo's hand. His scream pierced the air, but it didn't stop her. Anna broke free and ran into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. A moment after she vanished, a new scream echoed, a high-pitched female scream, even more terrifying because of its desperate, frantic tone. Ivo, clutching his hand where deep bite marks remained, turned to us, his face pale with pain and shock. We quickly treated the wound, but as we analyzed the events of the last few minutes, we realized a terrifying truth. Every time one of us stared too long at those mysterious eyes in the darkness, they lost control of themselves, as if falling under a hypnotic spell. This realization brought a new level of fear. We began to move with greater caution, trying to avoid any direct eye contact with those glowing spots that still flickered among the trees. We understood that dawn was still far off, and the night had only just begun. That night, as the thick darkness enveloped the forest, the starless sky was almost black, and the absence of the moon only heightened the oppressive atmosphere. The trees stood like black silhouettes against the dim sky, their branches swaying in the wind, creating a barely audible whisper that only intensified the anxiety. And in this setting, we were left alone with our fears, trying to survive that dreadful night. As Ivo began to suffer from sharp pain and increasing weakness, I felt his condition rapidly deteriorate. His breathing became more labored, his skin took on an unhealthy gray hue, and with each passing hour, he became less and less like himself. Emma and I took turns watching over him, keeping the fire going and trying to keep him conscious, but the night swallowed everything around us like a black hole. Soon Ivo began to rave. His words blurred with reality. He spoke of eyes watching him from the darkness, of voices calling to him. The forest seemed alive, the gazes of invisible beings pressing on us from all sides, like invisible weights threatening to crush our souls. We felt that every rustle of leaves, every whisper was not just the wind but something more, something dark and elusive watching us from the darkness. We sat in silence when Ivo suddenly changed. His breathing became erratic and weak. His skin took on an unhealthy gray hue. He began to speak incoherently, as if in another long-forgotten language. His words became less and less coherent until he fell silent. Ivo's last breath escaped as the first weak rays of dawn began to pierce through the tree branches. It was an end so sudden and unjustified that we couldn't believe what had happened. We huddled together, sitting in a circle by the fire, filled with horror and despair from the unknown and the fear of what this night might still bring. Despair and fear overwhelmed us as we realized that our camping trip had turned into a struggle for survival. We held each other tightly, waiting for the morning, ready for the trials of this night to continue. Emma and I found relative comfort in each other's silence. We sat close by the fire, which was smoldering at dawn, focusing our gazes on each other, avoiding the terrifying eyes that emerged from the shadows of the night. The weak rays of the sun painted golden highlights on our faces, giving the moment an almost sacred calm. But this silence didn't last long. Suddenly Emma shuddered, her gaze directed somewhere to the side, and a look of concern appeared in her eyes. Worried by her reaction, I turned but saw only darkness, through which nothing was visible, only cold gazes. When I looked back at Anna, she stood up as if invisible forces were lifting her. I immediately jumped up and reached out to grab and hold her, but she, as if in a trance, walked away from the fire, her steps leading her straight to the dark heart of the forest. I rushed after her but stopped when Emma turned to me with a pale face, expressing a strange mix of fear and calm. Her gaze seemed to say goodbye to me, asking me not to follow her. And then, as if hitting an invisible wall, I stopped, watching Emma's figure blend with the mystical mists of the forest. In a moment she was gone, leaving only the faint whisper of the wind as her message. Standing in the clearing, I felt despair and hopelessness engulf me with every breath. I screamed into the void, my voice echoing among the old trees, wishing for this nightmarish vision to end. I was ready to surrender to the elusive forces that had chosen us this dreadful night. However, as the sun rose higher, pushing the darkness into the background, the mystical light of day enveloped the forest, and all the mysterious eyes that surrounded us disappeared along with the shadows of the night. My search turned into a nightmarish journey through the forest I once considered a place of peace and rest. Walking among the trees, which now seemed like silent witnesses to the tragedy, I came across horrific scenes. The bodies of my friends were scattered in different corners of the forest. Each discovery was worse than the last. The bodies were brutally mutilated, with faces twisted in expressions of absolute horror and pain. When I found Ivo's body, scattered under a cover of moss and fallen leaves, it was almost unrecognizable. The body was covered with numerous cuts and marks that resembled scratches. I recognized him only by the remnants of his clothes, and it felt like a blow to the heart. It seemed that some invisible and cruel force was trying to reach something inside each of us. The fear that gripped me with each discovery mixed with a sense of absolute helplessness and bitterness. I remembered how we laughed and joked together, how I was going to tell Ivo about new plans. Now all of that was destroyed, turned into shattered dreams and unspeakable horror. When I came across the last body, Emma's lying under an oak tree, my heart barely held on. She lay with her eyes open, looking at the sky as if trying to find an answer or salvation that never came. Her expression was filled with terror, and I felt a part of me break along with her last breath. Sitting on the ground next to her final resting place, I realized I was completely alone in this forest, which now seemed foreign and hostile to me. All our plans, hopes, and dreams of adventures with friends dissolved into silence and emptiness. This forest, which was once a place of peace, was now the site of our worst fear, and I knew this nightmare would stay with me forever. Overwhelmed with pain and loss, I fell to my knees. What was supposed to be a simple trip with friends had turned into a tragedy that forever changed my life. I didn't know if I could ever return to normal life, if I could ever forget the faces of my friends in their last moments. After the horrific discoveries in the forest, I felt an obligation to give my friends a proper burial. I found a camping shovel among the remnants of our camp and began the hard and exhausting work. Each movement of the shovel was a painful reminder of what I had lost. I hoped to honor their lives and deaths by providing a final resting place among the sinister trees that had witnessed our last night. After finishing the burials, I quickly gathered my things and found the car keys that belonged to Emma. I hurried to leave this place, wanting to escape the horrors that surrounded me as quickly as possible. I reached the spot where we had left the car, and before getting behind the wheel, I felt the need to take one last look at the forest, which now lost its mystery in the light of the morning sun. My gaze lingered on the tall, dark figures standing at the edge of the forest. Alongside the huge figures were countless smaller ones, resembling people. There were so many of them that my eyes couldn't take in all their silhouettes. Suddenly, one of the smaller figures waved at me in a way that Anna often did. This moment became the horrifying final note of our dreadful adventure. My body shivered with cold, and I quickly jumped into the car, started the engine, and sped away, not looking back at the place that had forever etched itself into my soul as a deep wound, incapable of healing. The journey home was quiet and heavy. With each mile that distanced me from the forest, I felt despair and emptiness fill my being. Although I managed to escape this nightmare, my soul remained in the forest, entangled among the shadows and mysteries of that night. That night irreversibly changed me, leaving marks that could never be erased from my memory. Now let me share a moment from my life. I'm an artist, and oil painting both inspires and relaxes me. 8 years ago, I was so immersed in it that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day I looked back and realized the knowledge I needed when I was just starting out. That's why I've prepared an online course with 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or pointless chatter. Just rich content that's immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of renting a car for a day. Art therapy is a great way to deal with anxiety. Just check out the course content via the link in the pinned comment or in the channel description.